Hailey never called her parents to argue. She never sent an angry letter. She never showed up at their door demanding an explanation. She just worked. She was 33 years old, living in Chicago, Illinois, chief surgeon at one of the most respected hospitals in the Midwest. She had earned that title through 11 years of relentless, quiet, head-down work. Medical school, residency, fellowship. 70-hour weeks that turned into years that turned into a career that most doctors only dream about. But back home in Columbus, Ohio, her parents were telling a completely different story. They told the neighbors she had dropped out, told extended family she had struggled and disappeared, changed the subject whenever her name came up at dinner. For years, nobody in that circle knew what Hailey had actually become, until a local news crew walked into her hospital. Until the camera found her face. Until the broadcast aired on a Thursday evening in living rooms across 3 states, and her parents, sitting on their couch in Columbus, watched every second of it. They had built a lie for years. It collapsed in 4 minutes of television. What her father says when he finally calls, and her 12-word response, you need to hear it. Subscribe right now and hit that bell. This story is just getting to the part that matters most. My name is Hailey. I am 33 years old and I live in Chicago, Illinois. I have been chief surgeon at Midwest Regional Medical Center for 2 years. Before that, I was a cardiothoracic fellow. Before that, a surgical resident. Before that, a medical student who studied in hospital break rooms and library corners and every quiet space she could find between one exhausting shift and the next. I want to be honest with you from the very beginning of this story. I am not telling it for revenge. I am not telling it for sympathy. I am telling it because I spent 11 years building something real in complete silence, and I think there is something important in what that silence taught me. And in what broke it. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house where expectations were high and praise was rare. My father was an engineer, precise, exacting, uncomfortable with anything he couldn't measure or predict. My mother taught high school mathematics and held herself and everyone around her to a standard that left very little room for being human. They weren't cruel people, but they were the kind of parents who responded to a 98 on a test by asking what happened to the other 2 points. I spent my entire childhood trying to be enough for them. Straight A's, student council, debate team. Every box checked and handed over, waiting for the moment they would look at me the way I needed them to. That moment never came, and somewhere around 17 I quietly stopped waiting. I just didn't know it yet. I got into the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I was 22 years old. I had worked for that letter through 4 years of relentless undergraduate study, MCAT prep that consumed every weekend for 8 months, and 2 application cycles because the first one didn't go the way I needed it to. When the email came, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Columbus. I read it 3 times. Then I walked into the living room where my parents were watching television and I told them. My father muted the TV, looked at me, and said, medical school is a long road, Hailey. A lot of people start it and don't finish. Then he muted the television. My mother said, make sure it's what you really want. That was it. That was the celebration. The week before I left for Chicago, my father sat down with me at the kitchen table. He had a look on his face I recognized. The careful, measured expression he used when he believed he was being helpful by being hard. He told me medical school had one of the highest dropout rates of any graduate program. He told me the surgical track specifically was brutal, and that most people who attempted it discovered somewhere in the middle that they had overestimated themselves. Then he looked at me steadily and said, I just don't want you to be blindsided if it turns out this isn't for you. I sat across from him and held eye contact and said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything I wanted to say would take 11 years to say correctly. So I decided to wait and let the work speak. When I was ready, I left for Chicago on a Sunday morning in late August, 1 suitcase, a backpack. The acceptance letter folded in my jacket pocket, not for anyone else, just for me, a reminder of what was real when everything else felt uncertain. My parents walked me to the car. My mother hugged me briefly. My father shook my hand, which was the most formal and most telling goodbye he could have possibly chosen. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. And somewhere on I-70 heading northwest, flat Ohio farmland stretching out on both sides of the highway, I made a decision that I have never regretted. I was done waiting for their approval. Done performing for an audience that had already decided what they thought of me. From that exit ramp forward, I was going to build something real. And I was going to do it entirely on my own terms. I found out through my cousin Bree about 8 months into my first year of medical school. Bree was the one person from Columbus who had my actual phone number and used it. She texted me one evening, casual, just checking in, and then mentioned almost as an aside that she had run into my mother at the grocery store. My mother had asked about me vaguely. Bree had said I was doing well in Chicago, and my mother had changed the subject. Later that same week, Bree heard from another relative that my parents were telling people I had gone to Chicago for school, but that it hadn't worked out. That I had left the program, that I was figuring things out. I read Bree's message sitting on the floor of my apartment after a 12-hour lab day. They weren't just withholding pride. They were actively replacing my reality with a different one. I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided what to do with it. My first instinct was to call, to correct it, to send proof, my enrollment records, my grades, something tangible that would force them to stop. I drafted that call in my head a dozen times. I even picked up my phone once. Then I put it down, because I realized something sitting in that small Chicago apartment, surrounded by anatomy textbooks and coffee cups. Correcting them now would only start a conversation I didn't have the energy to finish. And anything I said with words could be argued with, dismissed, or quietly rewritten the same way they had rewritten everything else. But a career, a real, documented, undeniable career, couldn't be argued with, couldn't be changed, couldn't be subject to their version of events, so I made my decision. I would say nothing. I would just become someone they couldn't erase. First year of medical school is something you cannot fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. It is not hard the way a difficult exam is hard. It is hard the way water wears down stone, constantly, invisibly, without a single dramatic moment you can point to and say that was when it happened. It just keeps coming. The volume of information, the pace, the quiet competitive pressure of being surrounded by people who are all extraordinary and all exhausted and all pretending they are fine. I was not fine. By November of my first year, I was sleeping 4 hours a night, eating badly, and sitting in a bathroom stall between classes talking myself back from the edge of something I didn't have a name for yet. I never called Columbus. I just kept going. Dr. Carol Webb was a cardiothoracic attending at University of Chicago Medical Center and an adjunct professor in the surgical track program. She was 61 years old, precise, demanding, and completely uninterested in students who needed encouragement to do the work. She was exactly the kind of teacher who frightens you into being better than you thought you could be. She called on me in her seminar 3 weeks into the fall semester. I answered. She pushed back. I held my ground with the information I had. She looked at me for a moment, long enough to feel deliberate, and then moved on without comment. After class, she stopped me in the hallway. She said, "You didn't flinch. Most of them flinch." Then she handed me her card and told me to email her if I decided to pursue the surgical track seriously. I emailed her that same evening. I graduated from Pritzker School of Medicine in the top 4% of my class. The ceremony was held on a Friday morning in May, a bright, almost aggressively beautiful spring day on the University of Chicago campus. Chairs arranged on the main quad. Faculty in formal academic regalia. Families filling every available seat with cameras and flowers, and the specific proud noise that large, happy crowds make. I had one ticket. I had given it to Bree, who had driven up from Columbus alone specifically to be there. She cried through the entire ceremony and took more photos than I knew what to do with. My parents were not there. They had not been invited. Not out of bitterness, I simply understood by then that their presence would have cost me something I couldn't afford to spend on that particular day. That morning belonged to me, and it was perfect. Surgical residency at Northwestern Memorial Hospital was 3 years that I can only describe as a complete dismantling and rebuilding of everything I thought I knew about myself. The hours were unlike anything I had experienced in medical school. 30-hour shifts, back-to-back trauma cases. Procedures I was performing for the first time on patients who needed me to perform them perfectly. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of crossing that margin were ones I carried home in my chest every single night. I did not call Columbus once during those 3 years. Not on holidays, not on birthdays, not when I was struggling, not when I had victories worth sharing. I had made my peace with that silence a long time ago. It wasn't anger anymore. It was just the shape my life had taken. Word reached me through Bree during my second year of residency. My parents had attended the Dawson family reunion in Columbus, a large gathering of extended family that happened every 2 years at my uncle's property outside the city. I had not been invited, or if I had, the invitation had traveled through channels that somehow never reached Chicago. Bree had been there. And she texted me afterward, carefully, the way she always approached things involving my parents, to let me know that when relatives had asked about me, my father had told them I was still trying to figure out my path. That Chicago hadn't quite worked out the way everyone had hoped, still figuring out my path. During my second year of surgical residency at Northwestern, I read that message at 2 in the morning after a 16-hour shift and sat with it for a long moment. I made a choice that night that I want to tell you about, because I think it was one of the most important choices I ever made. I could feel the pain of it. The specific sting of being erased by the people who were supposed to be proudest. I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it took me to finish the cup of coffee I was holding. Then I put it down, and I picked up my anatomy reference and went back to work. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because I had learned something important during those years. Pain and fuel are made of the same material. The only difference is the direction you point them. My parents thought they were describing my life to that family. They were actually describing the gap between where I was and where they imagined me to be. And closing that gap, permanently, undeniably, was now the only response I was interested in giving. I completed my residency and was accepted into a cardiothoracic surgery fellowship at Midwest Regional Medical Center, one of 12 candidates selected from over 300 applicants nationwide. Dr. Webb had written my recommendation letter. 3 pages. She told me about it afterward and said, with the particular economy of warmth she reserved for moments that mattered, I wrote what I observed. The letter wrote itself. The fellowship was 2 years of the most specialized, demanding, and ultimately the most clarifying work of my entire training. I knew by the end of my first fellowship year that this was not just what I was good at, it was what I was built for. I accepted a full staff position at Midwest Regional upon completing my fellowship. Cardiothoracic surgery. My name is on the department roster. My own patients. My own OR somewhere in Columbus. Nobody knew any of this had happened. My first year as an attending surgeon at Midwest Regional was the quietest revolution of my life. Nobody outside that hospital knew what was happening inside it. No announcements. No calls home. No social media presence that connected my Chicago life to my Columbus past. I had kept those two worlds completely separate for years, not out of secrecy, but out of self-preservation. What I was building was too important to risk exposing to voices that had never believed in it. Every morning I walked into that hospital and felt the specific weight of what I had earned. Not heavy in a bad way. Heavy the way something real feels when you finally hold it after carrying it for a very long time. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and I had got there entirely alone. I did not network aggressively. I did not position myself politically within the hospital structure. I simply operated, and I operated well. Word travels differently in a hospital than it does in most workplaces. It moves through consult requests and referral patterns, and the quiet conversations that happen between colleagues after a difficult case. When a surgeon handles a complex procedure cleanly, people notice. When they do it consistently, people remember. By the end of my second year as an attending, I had a waiting list. Colleagues were requesting my involvement on cases outside my primary schedule. The department head had mentioned my name in 2 separate staff meetings in ways that told me something was being considered before anyone had said it directly. I kept my head down. Keep operating. Let the work keep talking. The conversation about the chief surgeon position happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Dr. Raymond Park, the hospital's medical director, called me into his office after a morning surgical block and asked me to sit down. He was a careful, measured man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood their weight. He did not use unnecessary language. He told me the current chief surgeon was stepping back at the end of the year. He told me the search committee had been reviewing internal candidates. And then he told me that my name had come up, not as a courtesy consideration, but as a serious one. I was 31 years old. The youngest candidate ever formally considered for that role at Midwest Regional. I kept my expression professional and steady in that office. But walking back down the hallway to my department afterward, I pressed my hand flat against the wall for just a second. Just to feel something solid. I called Bree that evening. Not to announce anything. The position wasn't confirmed yet, and I wasn't someone who celebrated before the work was finished. But Bree was the only person who had been present for enough of this story to understand what Tuesday's conversation actually meant. She answered immediately, the way she always did, like she had been half expecting my call. I told her about the meeting with Dr. Park, about the search committee, about being the youngest candidate considered. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob and said, "Hailey. Do you understand what you've done?" I smiled into the phone. The first real uncomplicated smile I had allowed myself in a long time. I told her I wasn't there yet. She told me I was already there, the title was just paperwork. Bree called me back 2 days later. She had been at her mother's house for dinner, a gathering that included several relatives who moved in the same social circles as my parents, and the subject of me had come up. Casually, the way it always did when extended family collected in one place. Someone had asked what I was up to these days in Chicago. My parents had answered. My mother had said I was doing okay, that I had tried a few different things, that I was currently working in healthcare, And then she had used the specific phrase that Bree repeated to me carefully and with visible anger in her voice, some kind of support role. I was 31 years old. I had just been approached for the chief surgeon position at a major Chicago hospital, and my mother was describing to family as working some kind of support role in healthcare. I listened to Bree, said very little, and let it settle into the same place I had been putting things like this for 11 years. The search committee completed their review in November, and Dr. Park called me back into his office on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after our first conversation. He offered me the position directly and without ceremony, which was exactly the kind of man he was, and exactly the kind of offer I respected. No performance, no build-up, just the facts clearly stated, and then silence while I considered. I did not need long. I accepted the chief surgeon position at Midwest Regional Medical Center on a Wednesday morning at 11:14 a.m. I remember the time because I looked at my watch when I said yes, some instinct to mark the moment precisely, the way surgeons mark critical points in a procedure. I drove home that evening and sat in my apartment in the quiet. No celebration. No calls. Columbus still had no idea that any of this existed. 6 weeks after I accepted the position, a producer from WCHI, a local Chicago news station, contacted Midwest Regional's communications office. They were developing a feature segment on young leaders reshaping medicine in the Midwest. They had a list of names they were considering. Mine was on it, submitted, I learned later, by Dr. Park himself without mentioning it to me beforehand. The communications director came to my office and explained the opportunity. A full feature. Camera crew on site for a day. Interview, surgical footage, colleague testimonials. The segment would air in primetime on a Thursday evening. I thought about it for less than a minute. I agreed. Not because I wanted attention, but because the work deserved to be documented, and because somewhere in a quiet part of me I understood, without fully examining it yet, that a camera has a way of reaching places a phone call never could. The producer from WCHI came to my office on a Tuesday morning to walk through the logistics of the shoot. She was young, sharp, and clearly good at her job, the kind of person who makes you feel immediately comfortable in front of a camera without you realizing that's exactly what they're doing. She explained the structure of the segment. A day of filming inside the hospital. Surgical footage, department walkthrough, a formal sit-down interview, and brief testimonials from colleagues who had agreed to participate. I asked one question, whether I had final approval on how my title and position were presented. She said yes without hesitating. I signed the release form that afternoon. And as I handed it back across the desk, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not nervousness. Something closer to readiness. Like a door I had been standing near for a long time had quietly swung open, and all I had to do was walk through it. The crew arrived at 6:30 on a Wednesday morning. 3 people, professional and unobtrusive, moving through the hospital with the practiced ease of a team that understood how to capture a world without disrupting it. They filmed the surgical wing during morning rounds. They followed me through 2 consults and a pre-operative briefing. They set up an or two during a scheduled procedure, filming from the observation area with long lenses that captured the room without compromising sterility. My residents were quietly fascinated and doing their best not to show it. My scrub nurse of 4 years, a steady, unflappable woman named Patricia, told the camera during her testimonial that I was the most focused surgeon she had worked beside in 22 years. She said it plainly, without decoration, the way Patricia said everything. I heard about it afterward and had to stand in the hallway for a moment before I could trust my face. The communications director confirmed the broadcast details the following week. The segment was scheduled to air Thursday evening during the primetime local news block on WCHI, standard Chicago broadcast. But WCHI had a content-sharing agreement with affiliate stations in Indiana and Ohio, which meant the segment would simultaneously air across a coverage area that stretched well beyond the city limits: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. I sat with that information for a moment when she mentioned it, not strategically. I wasn't engineering anything. The geography was simply what it was, the natural reach of a Chicago news station that happened to extend into the state where my parents had spent years telling people their daughter had lost her way. I filed that fact quietly in the back of my mind, said thank you, and went back to my surgical schedule for the afternoon. I found out afterward, Bree told me herself, completely unrepentant. The week before the broadcast, she had seen the segment listing appear in the WCHI programming schedule online. She had noted the affiliate coverage area. And then she had done something quietly and deliberately that she knew I would have stopped if she had asked permission first. She had made calls. Casual ones, the kind that sound like friendly conversation and carry information the way water carries sediment. She called her mother called two aunts. Those aunts mentioned it to neighbors. Someone mentioned it at a church group. Someone else put it in a family group chat. By Thursday evening, a significant portion of my parents' social world in Columbus knew to turn on the news. Bree told me all of this laughing. She said, "Hailey, I just made sure the right people had the channel. The rest was always going to be you. I watched the broadcast alone." I had considered calling Bree and watching together over the phone, but in the end I wanted the first viewing to be private. Just me and whatever that 4 minutes turned out to be. I poured one glass of wine, sat on my couch, pulled a blanket over my legs like it was any other Thursday evening. The news anchor introduced the feature segment at 6:47 p.m. Young Leaders in Midwest Medicine. Hospitals are evolving. A new generation redefining what surgical excellence looks like. Then my name, my title, my face on the screen. I watched myself walk through my hospital, calm, certain, completely in my element, and felt something move through me that I genuinely did not have a word for. Not pride, not vindication. Something quieter and deeper than either of those things, something that felt like the truth finally taking up the space it had always deserved. The segment ran 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know the exact length because Bree timed it and texted me afterward with the precision of someone who understood that details matter. In those 4 minutes, the anchor stated my full name twice, my title once, the hospital's name 3 times, my specialty, cardiothoracic surgery, clearly and without abbreviation. They showed footage of me in the OR, footage of me with my residents. The interview portion where I spoke about what drew me to surgery and what I believed the next generation of surgical medicine needed to prioritize. 4 minutes and 12 seconds of my actual life, documented, broadcast, and delivered directly into living rooms across 3 states, including one living room in Columbus where 2 people sat watching something that could not be argued with, explained away, or quietly reworded for the next family gathering. The truth had arrived. In high definition, at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday, Bree told me later that it started before the segment even finished. Her aunt called her mother while the broadcast was still running. A neighbor of my parents texted someone in the family group chat. A woman from my mother's church who had heard the dropped-out story more than once called my mother directly, warm and excited, completely unaware she was detonating something, to say she had just seen me on the news and wasn't that wonderful. My parents' phone rang 6 times in the 20 minutes following the broadcast. Relatives, neighbors. People who had accepted the quiet narrative of a daughter who hadn't made it, now calling to say they had just watched that same daughter being described as one of the most accomplished young surgeons in the Midwest. There was no managing that, no reframing it, no changing the subject. The segment had done in 4 minutes what 11 years of silence had been waiting to do. And somewhere in Chicago, I was finishing my wine, washing the glass, and getting ready for an early morning in the OR. I watched the segment alone in my Chicago apartment on Thursday evening. I had poured one glass of wine, sat on my couch with my feet tucked under me like I was watching any other Thursday night television. The news anchor introduced the feature with a brief setup: young leaders in Midwest medicine, hospitals evolving, new generation of surgical talent. Standard framing. Professional and clean. Then my face filled the screen, my name, my title, my hospital. 4 minutes of my world presented clearly and without embellishment to anyone watching across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. I watched myself and felt something I hadn't expected, not pride exactly, though that was part of it. More like recognition. Like finally seeing something reflected back accurately after years of watching it be described completely wrong. My phone buzzed once while the segment was still airing. Then again, then 3 times in quick succession. The segment ended and my phone rang immediately. Bree. I answered and didn't even say hello before she started talking, her voice moving fast and high the way it does when she has been sitting on something and finally has permission to release it. She told me she had made sure certain people in Columbus knew to watch Thursday evening news. She had not told me beforehand because she knew I would have asked her not to. She was completely unapologetic about this, and I loved her entirely for it. She told me her own phone had started ringing before the segment finished. Relatives, neighbors, family friends who had heard my parents' version of my life for years and were now sitting in their living rooms in Columbus watching 4 minutes of something that made no sense against everything they had been told. She was laughing and crying simultaneously. I just sat there holding my phone, quietly undone in the best possible way. My father called at 10 o'clock that night. I saw his name on my screen and stood up from the couch. I walked to the kitchen, stood at the counter in the dark for a moment just looking at his name lighting up the screen over and over. 4 years since we had spoken. 4 years of silence that I had chosen and maintained and made my peace with. And now here he was, calling at 10 p.m. on a Thursday, because a television screen had forced a conversation that 11 years of my actual life had not. I thought about letting it go to voicemail. I considered it seriously for about 30 seconds. Then I picked it up, not for him, not for the conversation I knew was coming, but because I had spent 11 years becoming someone who did not run from hard things, and I was not about to start now. My father spoke first. His voice was composed, or performing composed, which with him had always been difficult to distinguish. He said he had seen the segment. He said it was quite something. He said he had not realized things had gone so well for me in Chicago. He paused after that, leaving space, I understood, for me to fill it, with gratitude maybe, or relief that he had called, or some version of the door swinging open between us the way he had perhaps imagined it would. I let the pause sit for a moment, then I said 12 words, calm, clear, and without a single sharp edge. I know you didn't. I hope you're both well. Good night, Dad. And I ended the call, no anger, no speech. No list of everything he had missed or everything he had said or every way the silence had cost me. Just 12 words and a quiet ending, because everything else had already been said. On television, in an operating room, in 11 years of work he had never witnessed and could not take credit for. I sat at my kitchen table after the call and opened the journal I had kept since my first year of medical school. I turned to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote those 12 words down exactly as I had said them. Not to memorize them, not to congratulate myself, but because I wanted a record, for my own sake, of the person I had been in that moment. I had spent years imagining what I would say if my father ever called. In early versions of that imagined conversation, I said a great deal. Long, clarifying, devastating things that laid out every cost and every absence in precise detail, but the real version was 12 words. And it was better, quieter and truer and more complete than anything I had rehearsed in my head at 2 in the morning during residency. I closed the journal, made tea, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, absolutely nothing left unfinished. 3 months after the broadcast Midwest Regional announced the creation of a new surgical fellowship program. Dr. Park presented it at a full staff meeting, a competitive fellowship specifically designed to identify and support surgical candidates from underrepresented or non-traditional backgrounds. Candidates who had built their path without the usual infrastructure of family support, financial cushion, or institutional connection. He named it the Hailey M. Chen Surgical Fellowship. I was sitting in the third row when he said it, and I was genuinely not prepared, which almost never happens to me. Dr. Webb was sitting 2 seats to my left. She did not look at me when my name was announced. She just smiled at the front of the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching something they always knew was coming finally arrive. I stood when Dr. Park asked me to. The room applauded, and I stood there in it, steady and present, and let it be real. The morning after the fellowship announcement, I arrived at the hospital at 6:15, same time I always arrived, same entrance, same hallway. Same coffee from the same cart near the surgical wing elevator that made it slightly too strong and slightly too hot and was therefore perfect. I changed into my scrubs, reviewed the morning surgical schedule, checked in with my residents, 2 of them nervous in the specific way that tells you they care, which is always a good sign. Then I walked into OR3, pulled on my gloves, and looked up at the team assembled around the table. Good people. Skilled people. People who had shown up that morning to do something that mattered. I thought about Columbus for exactly 1 second, about a muted television and a handshake goodbye and a father who had not expected much. Then I looked at my team and said, "All right, let's begin." Because that was always the answer, not the phone call, not the broadcast, not the 12 words or the fellowship or the title on the door, just the work. The next patient. The next morning. The next chance to be exactly who I had decided, on a highway outside Columbus 11 years ago, that I was going to become. And I was, completely, undeniably, mine.